All right, welcome everyone. Today, we're diving into something truly fascinating. The idea that there might be sophisticated numerical patterns hidden inside the very structure of the Quran. I mean, just think about that for a second. What if a text that's been revered for centuries has this other layer to it, a mathematical complexity that we're only now beginning to see with our modern tools? It's a pretty mind-bending question. So, here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with the big idea itself. Then we'll get our hands on the key concepts you need to know. After that, we'll look at some actual patterns in the text. And finally, we'll dive into the big debate. What does it all mean? Okay, let's get right to the heart of it. The central idea here is that this text might have more than just spiritual depth. It might have a hidden mathematical structure, too. And look, we're not talking about just, randomly counting words here. This is a search for really sophisticated relationships that are tied to the chapters, the surahs, and even the letters themselves, suggesting a structure that's incredibly deliberate and intricate. Now, to really get a handle on these patterns, there are a few core concepts we need to understand first. Think of this next part as us getting our decoding toolkit ready. First up is this concept of ijaz ilmi. Traditionally, the miraculousness of the Quran was all about its incredible language, its poetry, but that idea has kind of expanded over time. Now it also includes exploring its scientific and, you guessed it, its structural and mathematical integrity. Next, we have these things called muqatta'at. You'll see these disjointed or mysterious letters right at the beginning of 29 specific chapters. Their exact meaning has been debated for centuries, but for our purposes, they are absolutely central to this whole puzzle. And finally, we've got the abjad system. Now, if you're familiar with gematria, this is kind of similar. Basically, every letter in the Arabic alphabet gets a number assigned to it. This adds a whole other layer to the analysis. For instance, the letter Qaf, which is the name of a whole chapter, represents the number 100. So you might be wondering, what kind of high-level math are we talking about here? Well, you might be surprised. It's often built on some pretty fundamental ideas. Take the famous 3-4-5 right triangle. The focus isn't on the theorem, but on the sum of its sides. 3 plus 4 plus 5 is 12. And that number, 12, just keeps popping up. Or take the fraction 22/7, a classic approximation for pi, which gets linked to things like the lunar cycle. Okay, toolkit assembled. Let's dive in and look at some of the actual specific patterns that researchers point to as evidence. So let's start with the big picture. The Quran has 114 chapters, or surahs, and right away there's this really neat division that researchers point to. Exactly 29 of them start with those mysterious letters we just talked about, and 85 of them don't. And guess what? 85 plus 29? Yup, that's 114. But this is where it starts to get really interesting. When you zoom in on very specific groups of chapters, certain patterns begin to pop up again and again. Let's take a look at one called Pola 12. Okay, so how does this work? Stick with me here. First, you take only the single-digit chapters, so chapters 1 through 9, that start with those mysterious muqatta'at letters. That leaves you with just 3, Surah 2, Surah 3, and Surah 7. Now, what do you think happens when you just add those chapter numbers up? 2 plus 3 plus 7 equals 12. And wait a minute. That's the exact same number from that Pythagorean sum we mentioned earlier. You see, it's this kind of recurring connection that gets researchers so intrigued. But wait, it doesn't stop there. The rabbit hole goes a little deeper. Using those exact same 3 chapter numbers, 2, 3, and 7, we find another pattern, sort of woven right into the first one. So this time, instead of adding 2, 3, and 7, what if we multiply them? Well, 2 times 3 times 7, that gives you 42. And what's so special about 42? It's not just some random number. It's the exact chapter number of another really important surah called Ashura. So the sum of the numbers gives you 12, and the product points you to a whole other chapter. Pretty cool, right? And look, these are just a couple of examples. There are others, like in Surah Qaf, which is chapter 50. If you take the digits 5 and 0 and do a little math, 5 squared plus 0 squared, you get 25. Researchers have linked that number to resurrection, which is a central theme of that very chapter. Then there are other patterns that use different combinations of chapters, but you guessed it, the numbers eventually reduce back down to 12. Okay, so the math here isn't really up for debate, right? 2 plus 3 plus 7 is 12. You can check that yourself. The real question, the thing at the very center of this whole discussion, is what does it all mean? And this is where you get two main schools of thought. On one side, you have people who say, look at how complex and interwoven these patterns are. There's no way a 7th century author could have planned this. This has to be evidence of a divine design. But on the other side, skeptics might say, hang on, the Quran is a big book. If you look hard enough in any large text, you're bound to find patterns. It's kind of a question of confirmation bias, right? Are we discovering something that was intentionally encoded, or are we just using modern math to describe properties that were already there? And it's worth noting there's a bit of a caution that comes up in the research, even from proponents. There's this idea that you don't want to get so caught up in decoding numbers that you lose sight of the text's main purpose, its spiritual and ethical teachings. It's all about finding a balance. So, after this whole journey through numbers, codes, and scripture, where does all of this leave us? Well, let's just quickly recap. We started with this mind-bending idea of a hidden mathematical layer. We got our toolkit ready with concepts like mukata'at. We looked at some real verifiable patterns like Pola 12. And then we stepped back to look at the big debate. Is it all by design, or is it just a massive coincidence? And that's really the key takeaway here. The patterns themselves, they're mathematically real, and they are absolutely fascinating. But what they signify, well, that's where the discussion and interpretation really begins. It's this balancing act between a mathematical fact and its potential spiritual meaning. And maybe that's the perfect place to leave it, with a question for you to think about. We live in a world that is just overflowing with data and patterns. So how do we decide what has real meaning? And in an age like this, what do we even consider a miracle?